My sister shouted. "You're making my kids homeless." I glanced around at the relatives she'd brought along to shame me, then answered, "If you care that much, one of you can give her your home. Mine isn't available." If you'd asked me a year ago who hated me most in my family, I wouldn't have hesitated for a second. It was Vanessa, my stepsister. She's 31 now, just a year older than me, and for over 2 decades, she made it her personal mission to remind me that I was never her real brother. The irony? She only started calling me family when she wanted my house. When my mom married my stepdad, Richard, I was 8. I was genuinely thrilled, dreaming of a dad and an older sister, especially since my biological father had passed away when I was 3. I thought my life was finally going to get better, but what I got was completely different. On their wedding day, I walked over to Vanessa with a small friendship bracelet, something I'd saved my birthday money for, thinking it would be our bond. She looked at it for 2 seconds, handed it back, and flatly said, "I'm not your sister. Don't call me that." I can still picture myself, standing there in my little suit, while adults awkwardly laughed, thinking she was just shy. She wasn't shy. She meant every single word. From that day on, she made sure I knew exactly where I stood. If anyone at school called us brother and sister, she'd immediately correct them. If relatives introduced us, she'd interrupt and explain we weren't actually related. Whenever friends came over, she'd say, "I was just my dad's wife's kid." Never once, not once, did she introduce me as her brother. As a kid, I kept trying. I'd ask her to play, to ride bikes. She'd always say no, or just leave without me. I even tried to include her when my friends came over, hoping she'd warm up. Instead, she'd make up embarrassing stories about me, just to make them laugh. Like the time she told half my 5th grade class I cried because I lost a spelling bee. A spelling bee I never even entered. Or that I wet the bed until I was 10. Total lies, but she knew people rarely checked. Richard, my stepdad, would occasionally tell her to be nice to your brother, and she'd immediately retort, "He's not my brother." Richard would sigh, tell her to stop arguing, and that was it. No consequences. My mom always said Vanessa was adjusting to the divorce and needed patience. Apparently, adjusting lasts over 2 decades. It only got worse when my younger half-sister, Emma, was born. Vanessa adored Emma, seeing her as her real sister because they shared the same father. She'd constantly tell Emma she had one real sister and one fake brother. Emma was too young to understand, but hearing that over and over eventually made her ask why Vanessa hated me. Still, no one really addressed it. Everyone just wanted peace. I learned quickly that in our house, keeping Vanessa happy was more important than holding her accountable. So I stopped trying. By high school, we barely spoke unless we absolutely had to. While she was out partying, I was working every weekend at a hardware store, saving every single paycheck. I wanted out. I wanted my own life. Vanessa would laugh at me working overtime, saying I was wasting my youth, while she was actually enjoying life. Maybe she was right in her own way. My teenage years weren't glamorous. I didn't travel, buy fancy clothes, or finance new cars I couldn't afford. I worked, studied, saved. After graduation, I got a scholarship for mechanical engineering, worked nights, and graduated with almost no debt. I landed a good job, designing manufacturing equipment, and slowly built my career. I wasn't rich, but I was financially stable before 30, and most importantly, debt-free. Every raise, every bonus, went straight into savings for a down payment. 4 years ago, I bought my first house. It wasn't huge, 3 beds, an office, a decent yard, a garage that needed work. It was older, but it had good bones. I spent almost every weekend renovating it myself. New floors, a remodeled kitchen, fresh paint, a re-landscaped yard, even a rebuilt deck with a coworker's help. By the time I finished, it was completely transformed. I was incredibly proud because I'd earned every single inch of it. Meanwhile, Vanessa's life went the opposite direction. She married Kyle, who had a decent roofing business. Together, they should have been comfortable. But comfortable wasn't enough for Vanessa. They leased luxury SUVs, bought expensive furniture, took lavish vacations every summer, constantly posting about living their best life. Every Christmas, new designer bags. Every one of her 3 kids' birthday parties looked like it cost more than my first car. Whenever relatives complimented my house, she'd shrug it off, calling it cute for someone who lived alone. The one time she actually visited after my renovations, She walked through every room without a single positive word. Before she left, she just looked around and said, "Seems like a waste for one person to have all this space." At the time, I thought it was just another snarky comment. Looking back, I realized she was already sizing it up, seeing it as something she deserved more than I did. We rarely spoke after that, usually only at holidays, and even then, she'd ignore me unless she needed something lifted, fixed, or assembled. Funny, I wasn't family until furniture needed moving. Then, last winter, everything changed. Kyle's business tanked after several large commercial contracts fell through. Instead of cutting back, they doubled down, refinancing cars, maxing out credit cards, convinced another big contract would save them. It didn't. The business collapsed completely. Creditors took their equipment, their vehicles were repossessed, and they fell almost 5 months behind on rent. One morning, Kyle packed a suitcase, told Vanessa he couldn't handle the pressure, and just left. Vanessa was suddenly unemployed, with 3 kids and nowhere to go. After the eviction, she, naturally, moved back into Richard and my mom's house. But their house only had 4 bedrooms. One for my parents, one for my half-sister Emma, who was away at community college, one for Richard's office. So Vanessa and her 3 kids were crammed into the last bedroom. According to my mom, everyone was miserable within 2 weeks. The kids fought constantly because there wasn't enough space. Vanessa complained about everything, the food, the internet speed. She expected my mom to babysit while she looked for work. Months passed with 0 interviews, yet Richard quietly covered her insurance payments because she couldn't risk losing the SUV while job hunting. Every call with my mom became a litany of complaints about how exhausted she was. I sympathized, but honestly, I stayed out of it. It wasn't my problem. Then, one Saturday afternoon, my mom called. She and Richard needed to discuss something important. I thought someone was sick, seriously. Instead, they sat at my dining table, looking incredibly nervous. My mom couldn't even meet my eyes. Richard cleared his throat and said, "We've been thinking about Vanessa's situation." I nodded, staying quiet, but the pit in my stomach already knew. He continued, "Your house has plenty of room." The second those words left his mouth, I knew. I knew exactly where this conversation was going, and I had a terrifying feeling it was about to change my relationship with my family forever. Richard leaned forward, hands clasped, like he was negotiating a business deal, not asking me for an astronomical favor. "Your mother and I were thinking maybe Vanessa and the kids could stay here for a little while, just until she gets back on her feet." I looked at him, then at my mom, who still couldn't look at me. "How long is a little while?" I asked. Richard just shrugged. "A few months, maybe." That answer alone told me they hadn't thought this through at all. A few months could easily become a year. I asked if Vanessa had found a job. My mom quietly said no. Actively interviewing anywhere? Another uncomfortable silence. Richard finally mumbled that she was focusing on getting the children settled first. Suspicious, given she'd been living with them for almost 3 months. Then, my mom finally spoke. She actually had another idea. I knew instantly I wasn't going to like it. "Maybe it would be easier if you stayed with us for a while instead." I blinked a few times. I honestly thought I'd misheard. "Stayed with you?" My mom nodded carefully. "Just temporarily. That way the children wouldn't have to keep moving, and your house already has enough bedrooms." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so utterly absurd my brain didn't know how else to react. "So, let me get this straight," I said. "Vanessa doesn't want to stay with me. She wants me to move out of my own house so she can move into it." Richard immediately tried to soften it. "It's not like that." "Then explain how it's different," I challenged. He opened his mouth, paused, and closed it again. My mom tried. "Honey, you're one person. She's raising 3 children." Another silence. I leaned back in my chair, looking around the dining room I'd spent months renovating. Every cabinet, every light fixture, every floorboard, I'd put them in myself. I remembered spending entire weekends covered in drywall dust because I couldn't afford contractors. And now they were asking me to pack a suitcase and leave because my stepsister decided she deserved it more? Did Vanessa actually ask for this? I already knew the answer. Richard sighed. It was her suggestion. Of course it was. My mom reached for my hand. "She's under a lot of stress." I gently pulled my hand away. "Mom, she spent 20 years telling me I wasn't family." "That was a long time ago," she protested. "Really?" Because last Christmas, her youngest son asked who I was, and she introduced me as Grandpa Richard's wife's son. That was 7 months ago. Neither of them said anything. Has she apologized for any of it? No. Has she admitted she treated me badly? More silence. Has she even called me? My mom quietly answered, no. I nodded. So, she doesn't think she owes me an apology, but she thinks I owe her my house. Richard's face got visibly irritated. Nobody's asking you to give away your house. If I move out and she moves in without paying rent, without a lease, and without an end date, what exactly am I doing? He kept insisting it was temporary, but neither of them could define temporary. I knew how this would go. 3 months becomes 6, 6 becomes a year, and a year becomes impossible to undo because nobody wanted to force children to move again. I'd seen enough stories. I knew the drill. I calmly told them, no. Not maybe. Not after I think about it. Just no. My mother immediately started crying. Richard looked disappointed, almost offended. I thought we raised you to help family, he said. That sentence infuriated me more than anything else he'd said all afternoon. Family? I asked. Interesting word. Where was all this family talk when Vanessa spent 20 years telling everyone I wasn't her brother? He looked away. She was a kid. She's 31 now. People change. Have you seen her change? I shot back. Because from where I'm sitting, the only thing that's changed is that she needs something. My mom quietly asked if I'd at least consider letting Vanessa and the kids stay while I remained in the house. I immediately shook my head. Absolutely not. Why? She asked. Because she'd never leave. Richard frowned. That's a pretty unfair assumption. I looked directly at him. She already believes she deserves my house. You don't think she'd suddenly decide the kids need stability after 6 months or a year? Then what happens? You asked me to wait a little longer because moving them would be unfair. Neither of them answered, because they both knew exactly how every future conversation would go. The reasonable person always had to compromise. That had been the rule my entire childhood. Richard finally stood up. I'm disappointed in you. I'm disappointed you even asked, I retorted. They left shortly after. My mom hugged me before leaving, but it felt different, like she knew she'd crossed a line. Richard just walked to his truck without another word. I honestly thought that would be the end of it. I'd said no. They'd heard me. Life would move on. Instead, everything exploded 3 days later. I was in a meeting at work when my phone started vibrating nonstop. I ignored it until lunch. When I checked, I had 18 missed calls and over 40 text messages. Most were from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. The first text read, "How could you do this?" Another, "Those poor children deserve better." A cousin called me selfish. An aunt said she expected more compassion. I was completely bewildered. Confused, I opened social media for the first time in weeks. Right at the top of my feed was a public post from Vanessa. She didn't use my name, but she didn't have to. She wrote about being abandoned by her husband, struggling to raise 3 children, and having a wealthy relative with a large, empty house who refused to help because he cared more about property than family. She claimed her children were sleeping on the floor because someone who claims to love family slammed the door in our faces. That part especially infuriated me because nobody had ever stood at my door. She ended by saying she hoped her children would never grow up as cold-hearted as some people. Thousands of people reacted. Hundreds of comments called me heartless without even knowing my name. The worst part? Relatives agreeing with her. People who had watched her reject me my entire childhood were suddenly acting like I was obligated to rescue her because she had children. I didn't respond publicly. Instead, I took screenshots of everything. Something told me this wasn't over. About an hour later, my phone rang again. It was Vanessa. Against my better judgment, I answered. She didn't even say hello. "You embarrassed, Mom," she shrieked. I almost laughed. "I embarrassed, Mom." She cried because you refused to help us. "No," I replied. She cried because she realized how ridiculous this request was. Vanessa's tone instantly turned ice cold. "You really are going to make my kids suffer over a childhood grudge? This isn't about childhood. Then what's it about? It's about the fact that you're asking me to leave my own home." She sighed dramatically, like I was the unreasonable one. "You don't even need all that space. That's not your decision. You're being selfish." "Maybe," I answered calmly. "But selfish people usually don't spend 20 years telling someone they aren't family before asking for their house." She went quiet for a moment. then said something that honestly made me smile. Dad agrees with me. That single sentence told me everything I needed to know. She genuinely believed she was going to win because she'd spent her entire life getting her way whenever Richard wanted to avoid conflict. Unfortunately for her, I wasn't 8 years old anymore, and this wasn't his house to volunteer. I ended the call without another word. There was nothing left to say. If Vanessa honestly believed Richard agreeing with her was going to change my mind, she hadn't been paying attention to the last 15 years of my life. Richard could be disappointed all he wanted, but disappointment didn't put his name on my mortgage. I figured she'd complain for a few days, then accept reality. I couldn't have been more wrong. The following Saturday, I was mowing my lawn when I saw an SUV slowly pull into my driveway. Then another. Then a pickup truck with a small utility trailer. My stomach tightened. I recognized Vanessa's vehicle. Before I could even turn off the mower, all 3 vehicles stopped, and people started climbing out, carrying cardboard boxes. At first, I genuinely thought they were dropping off donations somewhere else on the street. Then, Vanessa waved at me like we were old friends and shouted, "Perfect timing." I shut off the mower and walked toward the driveway, completely confused. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Moving in," she answered, as casually as if we'd already discussed it. I honestly stared at her for several seconds, thinking she had to be joking. She wasn't. 2 of our cousins had already started unloading plastic storage bins. One of my aunts was carrying grocery bags toward my front porch. Even Richard climbed out of his truck, looking deeply uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact. My mother wasn't there. That was the first thing I noticed. I asked Vanessa if she'd completely lost her mind. She rolled her eyes. Everyone talked about it, and we agreed, this is the best solution. Who's everyone? I asked. The people who actually care about family. One cousin awkwardly smiled and said they thought I'd change my mind after talking things over with Richard. I looked at him. Did I ever tell you that? His smile disappeared immediately. Well, no. Did anyone actually ask me? Nobody answered. Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. Look, everyone knows you're stubborn. We figured once the kids were actually here, you'd stop acting like this. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She hadn't come to ask again. She decided to skip my answer entirely and rely on social pressure to force me into accepting her. She genuinely thought that if enough relatives showed up carrying boxes, I'd be too embarrassed to send them away. Unfortunately for her, she had seriously misjudged me. I walked straight past everyone, unlocked my front door, stepped inside, and locked it again behind me. Through the front window, I saw confused faces. 30 seconds later, my phone rang. "Vanessa," I answered. "Open the door," she demanded. "No. Stop making a scene. You're the one trying to move into someone else's house." She sighed loudly. "The kids are standing outside in the heat. Then maybe you should take them somewhere that actually belongs to you." She started raising her voice. "You're seriously going to do this?" "Yes," I said. "I am." She hung up. About 5 minutes later, loud knocking. Then more knocking. Then Richard's voice, asking if we could all just talk calmly. I opened the door just enough to step onto the porch behind me, making sure no one could push past. Richard looked exhausted. "Son," he started. "Don't," I interrupted. "Don't call me son when you're standing in front of my house, trying to help someone move in after I already said no." His face fell. He admitted the whole thing was Vanessa's idea, but insisted he only came because he hoped I'd reconsider once everyone was present. I asked him one question. "If I showed up at your house with a trailer full of my furniture after you told me no, what would you do?" He didn't answer. Vanessa answered for him. "That's completely different." "How?" I challenged. "Because you don't have children." There it was again. Every argument somehow came back to her having children, as if giving birth automatically entitled someone to other people's property. I looked around at everyone standing in my driveway. Did any of you ask whether Vanessa offered to pay rent? Silence. Did any of you ask whether she'd contribute to utilities? More silence. Did anyone ask how long she planned to stay? My aunt quietly admitted they assumed it would only be a few months. I turned to Vanessa. "How long?" She crossed her arms. "Until I'm financially stable. However long that takes. 6 months? A year? If necessary, 2 years." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Everyone else finally understood exactly what I'd understood from the beginning. There was no plan, no deadline, only the expectation that once she got inside, removing her would become my problem. I looked directly at my cousins. You all helped carry boxes because you thought I had agreed. I didn't. I never agreed. I told my parents no 3 separate times. Vanessa knew that. Both cousins immediately set their boxes back onto the trailer. One quietly apologized for getting involved. My aunt looked horrified. Vanessa, is that true? Vanessa instantly became defensive. He's twisting everything. I simply pulled out my phone, opened the text conversation I'd had with my mother days earlier, and handed it to my aunt. The messages clearly showed my mother asking me to reconsider, and me repeatedly refusing. No misunderstanding. No mixed signals. Just a very clear no. My aunt read the messages, looked at Vanessa, then slowly handed my phone back without a word. One by one, relatives started putting everything back into the vehicles. Nobody argued anymore. Nobody told me to reconsider. They had all realized they'd been manipulated into participating in something they never would have agreed to if they'd known the truth. Vanessa completely lost control. She started yelling that everyone was abandoning her. She accused my cousins of being cowards, accused me of humiliating her on purpose. She even blamed Richard for not acting like a father. That's when something happened I honestly never expected. Richard raised his voice, louder than I had ever heard in my entire life. Enough. The entire driveway went silent. He looked directly at Vanessa. He told us no. I should have respected that. This is over. She stared at him in disbelief. You're taking his side? Richard closed his eyes for a second, then answered quietly. I'm taking the side that's actually right. For the first time since I was 8 years old, he wasn't asking the reasonable person to give in just to keep the peace. Unfortunately, it had taken 3 decades and a driveway full of embarrassed relatives for him to finally get there. Vanessa looked around, waiting for someone to defend her, but no one did. My cousins quietly loaded the last boxes. My aunt avoided looking at her. Even the children had stopped talking, sensing the gravity of the moment. Richard stood there, shoulders slumped, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked defeated. Vanessa wasn't used to hearing the word no, especially not from him. So, instead of accepting it, she doubled down. She pointed at me and screamed that I had manipulated everyone against her, that I'd been waiting years for revenge because she'd never accepted me as a brother. I almost laughed at the irony. You're right about one thing, I said. You never accepted me as your brother. And that's exactly why none of this makes sense. She frowned. I continued before she could interrupt. For over 20 years, you told everyone I wasn't family. You corrected teachers, relatives, even your own children when they accidentally called me Uncle Nathan. You made sure no one thought we were brother and sister. Then the second you needed a free house, suddenly I'm family again. Which is it, Vanessa? Am I your brother or not? She opened her mouth, but couldn't answer. That's what I thought. My mother finally arrived a few minutes later. She'd been grocery shopping. Judging by her expression, she already knew something had gone terribly wrong. She walked straight to me and quietly asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, but that this could never happen again. She nodded immediately. Then, to my surprise, she turned to everyone gathered in the driveway and admitted the truth. She said she had asked me to reconsider several times, but I had refused every single time. She admitted I had never led anyone to believe Vanessa could move in. Most importantly, she admitted giving Vanessa hope had been her mistake, not mine. Hearing my mother say that out loud changed the atmosphere completely. The last few relatives, who had still looked uncertain, immediately understood. Vanessa hadn't simply misunderstood my answer. She had ignored it, believing enough public pressure would force me to change my mind. My oldest cousin shook his head. Vanessa, you told us he'd agreed. She didn't deny it. Instead, she started crying. Real tears this time, not the frustrated kind she'd been producing earlier. For a brief moment, I actually felt sorry for her. Losing your husband, your home, your financial security, that would break most people. Then she pointed at me and screamed that everything was my fault, because if I had just acted like family, none of this would have happened. Whatever sympathy I'd started feeling disappeared instantly. I calmly asked everyone one question. If any of you believe she deserves free housing, why hasn't anyone offered your own house? Nobody spoke. They all loved volunteering mine, but none seemed interested in volunteering theirs. My aunt quietly admitted they lived in a 2-bedroom condo. One cousin said his apartment wouldn't allow additional occupants. Another relative explained they already had 4 children themselves. Every answer was perfectly reasonable. None of them wanted to sacrifice their own homes. Somehow, I was the selfish one for feeling exactly the same way. Within another 10 minutes, every box was back in the trailer. Every vehicle pulled out of my driveway. The only people left were my mother, Richard, and me. Richard stood silently for almost a full minute before finally speaking. "I owe you an apology." Those were 4 words I'd waited over 20 years to hear. He admitted he'd spent most of Vanessa's life giving in because arguing with her was exhausting. Every time she caused problems, he'd convinced himself keeping the peace was the easiest solution. But he realized all he'd really done was teach her that if she pushed hard enough, everyone else would eventually surrender. He said watching her try to take over my house had finally forced him to see how badly he'd failed both of us. I appreciated the apology, but I also told him the truth. One apology couldn't erase decades of being expected to compromise, while Vanessa never had to. If we were going to have a relationship moving forward, things had to change. He nodded and said he understood. My mother hugged me before leaving, quietly saying she was proud that I had stood my ground, even if she'd been too afraid to support me at the beginning. Over the next few months, things slowly settled down. Vanessa eventually accepted a full-time office job through one of Richard's former co-workers. Between her income and child support she finally pursued through the courts, she was able to rent a small townhouse for herself and the kids. It wasn't the large suburban home she'd wanted, but it was hers. We haven't spoken since the day she tried to move into my house. She never apologized, and honestly, I stopped expecting one a long time ago. Richard and I have slowly rebuilt our relationship. It isn't perfect, but for the first time I can remember, it's honest. He no longer asks me to keep the peace simply because it's easier. My mother still visits every few weeks, though now she calls before coming over, and she no longer keeps a spare key to my house. That wasn't meant as punishment. It was simply a boundary I needed after everything that happened. As for me, my life is surprisingly peaceful again. The house is still exactly where it was, only now it has security cameras and new locks. Sometimes relatives still ask whether I regret refusing to help because of the children. My answer is always the same. I never refused to help because there were children. I refused because helping someone should never require surrendering your home, your boundaries, and your self-respect to a person who spent a lifetime insisting you weren't family until they needed something you owned. Looking back, I don't think the house was ever the real issue. The house was just the final test. The real question was whether I was finally willing to stop sacrificing my own peace to make everyone else's life easier. For the first time in my life, my answer was no. And it turned out to be the best decision I ever made. So, I've told you my story, and trust me, it was a wild ride. But I have to ask, if you were in my shoes, faced with this kind of unbelievable situation, what would you have done? Let me know in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts.